Appearing in 1847, the same year as Thackeray's Vanity Fair, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights take the English novel in new directions. The Brontes' works are often passionate and angry, echoing the revolutionary sentiments of the 1840s. As we noted in our last lecture, the 40s were a decade of political and economic upheaval, as well as a decade of protest. The Brontes' writing also borrows heavily from the works of the Romantic poets, and their male characters resemble the heroes of Lord Byron. As we'll see, the sisters do have much in common, though in the end, their works are distinct. In this lecture, we'll focus on their differences as well as their similarities. Because the Brontes are so important as cultural icons, because people want to know about their own lives, we really do need to start with biography this time. The Brontes grew up in Haworth, a small town in Yorkshire. Their father was a clergyman, originally from Ireland. There were 6 children in the family, 2 of whom died in childhood after contracting tuberculosis at school. The story of the Brontes reminds us that death was an inescapable presence in the lives of 18th and 19th century writers. And I have to say that in preparing these lectures, I was struck by how many of our writers lost a sibling or a parent in childhood. Perhaps one reason that the classic novels so often include powerful death scenes is that many of the novelists had encountered such scenes in life. The surviving children were Charlotte, the eldest, Branwell, the only brother, Emily, and Anne. Here we might note the dates for both Charlotte and Emily. Charlotte is born in 1816 and dies in 1855. Emily is born in 1818 and dies in 1848. The children lost their mother at an early age. Emily was only 3, in fact, and they became exceptionally close, reading and writing stories for each other and exploring the moors together. The children were mostly educated at home. In their mid-20s, Charlotte and Anne spent a year in Brussels, where Charlotte fell in love with their teacher. This experience would later be the basis for her novel Villette, published in 1853. At different points in time, all of the sisters worked as governesses or teachers, and both Charlotte and Anne used their experiences in these positions as the basis for some of the events and characters in their books. From childhood, the Brontes dreamed of literary fame, but also feared the consequences of public exposure. Their first publication was a collection of poems, and as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Emily really is a distinguished poet. She's an important Victorian poet. The sisters chose to publish these poems under ambiguous pseudonyms: Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, hoping to divert attention from themselves. And it's worth noting that they chose pseudonyms that were neither clearly male nor clearly female. They wanted their gender identities to remain somewhat anonymous. In 1847, when Charlotte's Jane Eyre became a literary sensation, and this work was incredibly popular, readers and reviewers were eager to know the author's true identity. Readers could not tell if Currer Bell was a man or a woman, and they debated the question endlessly. One reviewer said that Jane Eyre would be praiseworthy if the work of a man, but odious if that of a woman. And we might just stop and think about that for a minute. If the author is a man, the book is great. But if the author is a woman, it's odious. Now clearly, gender is an issue for these writers. It's not something that we're imposing on them because of our own preoccupations. It's something that's right there, moving through their own culture. Now, the Brontes soon revealed their identities to their publisher. Even he didn't know at first, though Charlotte insisted that she be forever known to the public as Currer Bell. Even more reclusive than Charlotte, Emily had few friends outside her immediate family. Of the sisters, she was the one most attached to the pseudonyms. Emily died a year or so after publishing Wuthering Heights. Branwell had preceded her in death, and Anne would follow her soon, all dying within a span of just 9 months. So here's Charlotte. She's lost 2 sisters in childhood. She's lost her mother. Now she loses all of her surviving siblings. She's left alone with her father. She continues to write, publishing 2 more novels before her death, including Villette. She also marries, eventually settling down with her father's curate, and she is thought to have died of an illness associated with pregnancy. As one might expect, Charlotte and Emily have many things in common. Their novels do respond to the social upheavals of the day, echoing the revolutionary sentiments of the late 1840s. Jane Eyre begins with an act of rebellion, as Jane strikes back at her abusive cousin. Her bold action is all the more remarkable because she's an orphan, dependent on the generosity of his family. "Wicked and cruel boy," she says. "You are like a murderer. You are like a slave driver. You are like the Roman emperors." Now in this, Jane may seem to be going too far, especially since her cousin is only a schoolboy of 14. Even so, she may have a point when she asserts the essential similarity of all forms of oppression. Jane's rebellious act is swiftly and harshly punished. She's locked in a room where she imagines she can see the ghost of her dead uncle, and yet her sense of injustice is hardly relieved. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, she recalls, all his sister's proud indifference, all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality turned up in my disturbed mind like a dark deposit in a turbid well. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor? We need to remark on the eruption of those final questions, since they reveal a profound insight into the psychology of oppression. And this is a very, very important point. On the one hand, Jane knows that her cousins are loathsome wretches. She knows that. But on the other, she still desires to please them, and not only in order to avoid punishment, but also because she seeks affection and love. Later, as she returns to expressions of contempt for her hypocritical cousins, Jane once again turns that contempt in upon herself. "I was a discord at Gateshead Hall," she says, and Gateshead is just the name of the town, the house, or the house where her cousins and her aunt reside. "I was a discord at Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children or her chosen vassalage, the servants. If they did not love me, in fact, as little did I love them. They were not bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, in propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, cherishing the germs of indignation at their treatment, of contempt of their judgment. I know that had I been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery." Now, let's consider some of what Jane is doing in this passage. The repetition of the word thing, it turns up 4 times in all, suggests that Jane is struggling against the temptation to deny her own humanity. She is fighting to see herself as something other than useless and noxious. Jane is occupied with this struggle throughout the rest of the novel. She not only protests against the injustice of class distinctions, as she does in these passages, but also insists on the equality of men and women, explicitly rejecting conventional views of gender difference. It is vain, Jane says. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions besides political rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm, generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. Very powerful passage even today. Now, vain, narrow-minded, thoughtless. These are the terms that Jane uses to describe those who hold conventional views of gender roles and gender identities. At this point, she refuses to accommodate those who would demean or degrade her. Turning our attention to the work of Emily Brontë, we would notice that Heathcliff, the central figure of Wuthering Heights, also rejects social values. He does so even more emphatically, because what matters to him is not wealth or status, but his intense attachment to Catherine Earnshaw. Heathcliff is an orphan, brought to live with Catherine's family as a child. Despite a brief period of antagonism, the two of them become devoted friends, spending long days together on the moors. As many critics have noted, their relationship, though often described as passionate, probably should not be understood as sexual, in spite of all the images left over from the Laurence Olivier version, the film version of the story. Catherine and Heathcliff's earliest experiences together, the ones that mean the most to them, the ones that they're constantly trying to recreate over the course of the novel, somehow appear pre-adolescent. Heathcliff is jealous and confused when Catherine begins to be courted by Edgar Linton. Edgar is the opposite of Heathcliff, gentle where he is rough, refined where he is crude. What's more, Edgar is also good-looking and rich. Nevertheless, Edgar falls short of Heathcliff in many respects, lacking his strength and spirit. In one of the novel's most remarkable scenes, Heathcliff overhears Catherine announce that she's accepted Edgar's proposal of marriage. He can't help but feel, and neither can we, that she's simply succumbing to social pressure, betraying herself as well as her childhood friend. In this scene, when asked why she loves Edgar, Cathy can give only the most superficial and trivial of reasons. Because he's handsome and pleasant to be with. These are her own words. Because he's handsome and pleasant to be with. Because he's young and cheerful. Because he loves me. And finally, because he will be rich, and I shall like to be the greatest woman of the neighborhood. Compared with her feelings for Heathcliff, as she makes clear later in the same scene, all of this is trivial. My love for Linton, Catherine says, is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind. The really important things in life, this passage asserts, are beyond the reach of society, and maybe beyond the reach of time as well. These things have nothing to do with money or rank, and they join us not to the current season, winter or spring, whatever it is, but rather to eternity itself. In addition to challenging social values, the Brontës also reveal the limitations of earlier love stories, endowing their fiction with the intensity of romantic poetry. Their male characters are descendants of the Byronic hero, difficult and dangerous, yet also powerfully attractive. Here, we might note that Byron's public career as a poet began in 1812, about 4 years before Charlotte was born, with the publication of the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And Childe Harold made him a huge, huge, huge star in the literary world. He became a kind of dominant figure for the rest of his life. Byron's career would end with his death in 1824, when Charlotte and Emily were 8 and 6 years old, respectively. Though of an earlier generation, Byron was an important influence on both sisters. The sisters were drawn to the idea of a hero who had the potential for great evil as well as great good. They were also fascinated with the effect of disappointment and resentment on such a person. Byron's heroes have often done wrong, but they have just as often been wronged, or at least misunderstood, and their relationship to other people is deeply vexed as a consequence. The Byronic hero is also a quester, a searcher. Dissatisfied with social norms and social values, he seeks something far greater, a connection to the largest and most powerful forces in the cosmos. And I'll just say here before going on that if you're interested in reading a work by Byron and getting some sense of what the Byronic hero is like, you might start with a work called Manfred, which he wrote in 1817. Manfred is a closet drama. That is, it's laid out in the form of a drama with speeches, entrances and exits, but it was never intended for the stage. Much of the action takes place in the Alps. Manfred is also a kind of Byronic version of the Faust story, the Faust legend. So if you're familiar with that figure of Faust or that tradition of the Faust story, you can get some sense of, what the Byronic hero is all about. Like the Byronic hero, Jane's master and eventual husband, Mr. Rochester, can be violent and domineering. He has led a dissolute life, wasting much of his potential, and thus feels himself undeserving of happiness. "For 10 long years I roamed about," he tells Jane at one point, "living first in one capital, then another. I sought my ideal of a woman amongst English ladies, French countesses, Italian signoras, and German Grafinnen. I could not find her. Sometimes, for a fleeting moment, I thought I had caught a glance, heard a tone, beheld a form, which announced the realization of my dream. But I was presently undeceived. You are not to suppose that I desired perfection either of mind or person. I longed only for what suited me, and I longed vainly." Now all of that is straight out of Byron. Roaming, seeking, but never finding, catching a glimpse, but losing the spell, longing and longing vainly. Couldn't be more Byronic. If Rochester is a good example of a kind of updated Byronic hero, well then Emily's Heathcliff is even more complex. Heathcliff can be cruel as well as loving, and the other characters in Wuthering Heights often describe him as a monster or a ghoul. After Catherine's death in the middle of the novel, she claims that she's died at his hand, and in some sense that's probably not an exaggeration. Heathcliff refuses to accept any kind of separation from her. Indeed, he would rather be haunted by her than separated from her. In this passage, he begins by cursing Catherine, then goes on to declare that she's both his life and his soul, welcoming the chance to be haunted by her. So these are the words he speaks to Catherine. She's on the other side. She's now dead. May she wake in torment, he cried, with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? So, not in hell, not in heaven, not dead. Where? Where is she? And here I think Heathcliff is just struggling with the feelings we often have when we're confronting death. How can this other person be gone? They must be somewhere. Where is it? So now he's going to turn to Catherine herself, and here's what he says. Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you? Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. In studying authors from Richardson to Austen, and even when looking at Dickens and Thackeray, we've seen many different kinds of love stories. Never before have we seen anything remotely like this. Never before have love and hate been so closely connected. Never before have we been asked to consider the possibility that human emotions might somehow transcend death itself. In many ways, then, just to sum up, we might say that in many ways, the sisters are very similar. They are both capable of great anger and real passion. They both have deep sympathy for the figure of the outcast or underdog, and they both draw on Byron for inspiration. Despite these similarities, it would be a mistake to treat the sisters as a unit, to lump them together and leave it at that. In the end, these two writers, these two women, are fundamentally different from one another. Although Charlotte is indeed capable of expressing anger, she seems cautious and conservative by nature. At the beginning of Jane Eyre, Jane is an orphan. She has no money and no home of her own, and she is keenly aware of her dependence on others. We've noted that already. As governess to the children of Mr. Rochester, a little bit later in the book, Jane is in a complicated position. Neither a member of the family, nor really one of the servants. After falling in love with Rochester, Jane discovers that he is married to another woman, Bertha Mason, now known, thanks to scholars Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, as the Mad Woman in the Attic. Bertha is a Creole woman from the West Indies whom Rochester married for her money. She has indeed gone mad and does indeed live in his attic, emerging at various points in the story and appearing just in time to spoil Rochester's marriage to Jane. Although Rochester does offer to live with Jane in a kind of marriage, Jane rejects this proposal. Even as she does, however, she draws a parallel between herself and Bertha. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man, Jane explains. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad. They have a worth, so I have always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count on its throbs. By the end of the novel, Jane and Rochester have been reunited. Bertha has perished in a fire, and he has been blinded while trying to rescue her. What's more, Jane has gained a fortune of her own, inheriting a large sum of money from her uncle. Thus, just as Jane obeys God's law, Charlotte Brontë upholds the comedic conventions of the English novel tradition. By the end of her story, her angry, outcast heroine has been promoted into the ruling class. Here's how all of that gets wrapped up and summed up by Jane herself at the end of the novel. I have now been married 10 years. I know what it is to live entirely for and with what I love best on earth. I hold myself supremely blessed, blessed beyond what language can express, because I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine. No woman was ever nearer to her mate than I am. ever more absolutely bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. I know no weariness of my Edward's society. He knows none of mine, any more than we each do of the pulsation of the heart that beats in our separate bosoms. Consequently, we are ever together. To be together is for us to be at once as free as in solitude, as gay as in company. We talk, I believe, all day long. To talk to each other is but a more animated and an audible thinking. All my confidence is bestowed on him. All his confidence is devoted to me. We are precisely suited in character. Perfect concord is the result. For many readers, this resolution is deeply satisfying. Jane finds love, finds a home, finds security and peace at last. Her wandering is over. She is no longer a thing, but a person. For other readers, this ending is deeply disappointing. Here we see the rebellious, fiery Jane quite literally domesticated, insisting that she lives entirely and fully for her husband. At times, Jane characterizes her marriage as one of mutual devotion, and in those moments it is indeed hard not to feel happy for her. At other times, she is simply incorporated into her husband, becoming bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. At those times, there's not much room for mutuality or reciprocity. For our purposes, the really important point is the comedic nature of this resolution. Poetic justice is indeed achieved here. Jane gets what she wants and deserves, and so, finally, does Rochester. What's more, the couple is abstracted out of time and space, transported by their love beyond weariness, beyond bondage, beyond discord and doubt. It's not exactly the same as Jane Austen, but it's not as different as you might expect. Now, in comparison with Charlotte, Emily Brontë seems much more daring. Her vision is broader, taking in two families and two generations. The action of the novel spans a period of decades, starting in the early 1770s and ending around 1802. The turning point of Wuthering Heights, as we've noted, is Catherine Earnshaw's decision to marry Edgar Linton instead of Heathcliff. Unable to accept this decision, Heathcliff runs away and stays away for a period of 3 years. When he returns, he's almost completely transformed, having mysteriously gained a fortune of his own. Upon his return, Heathcliff devotes his life to revenge. He gains control over Catherine's brother and enters into a loveless marriage with Edgar's sister. Later, after most of his own contemporaries are gone, he continues to seek power over their children, eventually tricking Catherine's daughter into marrying his own son. At the end of the novel, however, Heathcliff and Catherine seem to be reunited in death. Significantly, there is no suggestion of poetic justice in Heathcliff's death. Because he welcomes death, we cannot see it as a punishment for his sins. Here's how the events surrounding Heathcliff's death are reported by the narrator. "We buried him," the narrator says, "to the scandal of the whole neighborhood, as he wished." He's wanted to be buried alongside Catherine, and they grant that wish. "Earnshaw and I, the sexton, and 6 men to carry the coffin, comprehended the whole attendance. The 6 men departed when they had let it down into the grave. We stayed to see it covered. Hareton, with a streaming face, dug green sods and laid them over the brown mold himself." This is a boy who's been raised kind of as a son by Heathcliff. "At present, it is as smooth and verdant as its companion mounds, and I hope its tenant sleeps as soundly. But the country folks, if you ask them, would swear on the Bible that he walks. There are those who speak to having met him near the church and on the moor, and even within this house. Idle tales, you'll say, and so say I. Yet that old man by the kitchen fire affirms he has seen 2 on 'em, looking out of his chamber window on every rainy night since Heathcliff's death." Though both works are remarkable, Wuthering Heights is ultimately the more distinctive of the two. Wuthering Heights confounds the usual novelistic distinctions between love and hate, birth and death, creation and destruction. Emily Bronte's major characters transcend conventional notions of good and evil, and the death of those characters is a precondition for the survival of the rest. Let's remember here that there's often an element of scapegoating or sacrifice about tragedy. For the good of the community, the tragic figure must be expelled or eliminated. And that certainly seems to be the case in Wuthering Heights. For it's not until Heathcliff and Catherine are both gone that the members of the next generation can begin to find peace or fulfillment. A century earlier, Richardson had produced a great tragic novel, In Clarissa, and about half a century later, Hardy would produce tragic novels like Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Between Richardson and Hardy, Wuthering Heights stands alone, one of the few Victorian novels with the shape and scope of a tragedy.